Today I'm going to show you how to make some mosaic pins, just as something to fancy up your knife a little bit if you are so inclined. Some of the materials I've got, something to measure with. Got a brass tube, this one's 1/4 inch outside diameter. Got a piece of brass rod, and then I'm using today some aluminum rods just to give a little bit different color, the gold and the silver color. Need a tube cutter to get a nice clean cut on your brass tube. You can use a hacksaw, but I found that you get a much cleaner cut. So let's do that one first. I like to work in 6-inch or shorter lengths. Trying to fill a tube this long, it's just a little bit more difficult to work with, and sometimes your pin pattern at one end won't match your pin pattern at the other end. So I'm just going to mark a line, the halfway point on this tube, 6 inches. And then use my tube cutter and just run it around. It's got a sharp edge on the inside. Tighten a little bit and keep running it around till you get all the way through. This way you get a nice clean cut at the end. It's a lot easier to work with that way, nothing to dress up after that. I've already marked the aluminum and the brass rods, and for those I just cut them with a pair of lineman's pliers. They cut very easy. They'll go flying all over the place when you do. Now this brass rod is a little bit thicker, a little bit too thick for using the lineman's pliers, so I've already pre-marked that and cut part way through with a hacksaw. So that's all that's left, is to just bend it like that. So now I've got the material that I need for my mosaic pins. So it's important to dry fit it, because you'll find out if you've made any mistakes, like I think I did here. You put in one brass tube or rod, and then we'll take one of the aluminum pins, and that's a pretty snug fit already. So I realized that I've grabbed the wrong material. Now that'll work just like that. You can do any kind of pattern you want, but that's not the pattern I intended for today. Just to show you some other ideas. Even if you do make mistakes with the size of the material, you can still work with it. You can take 3 of your aluminum pins and do like a clover leaf, if I can fit 3 in here. You can do a clover leaf pattern. A little difficult to see when there's nothing in the resin and they haven't been smoothed out. But it is possible to work with materials of different sizes. What I intended to cut instead of the aluminum pins were these nickel silver pins. They're a much smaller diameter, as you can see. So let me cut those now. They too are pre-scored. Alright, so now let's try the dry fitting this way. Take the brass tube, take one of the brass pins, and I want 4 of the nickel silver pins in there. Much better. So now I'm getting the pattern that I want. See if I can show it to you. Again, a little hard to see when it's just dry fit in like that. So let's go to the next step, which is preparing the epoxy to go into your tubes, or preparing the tubes to receive the epoxy. The way I like to do it, I've got just a board with a couple holes drilled in it. Now these holes do go all the way through. What I have found is that if you drill partway through, the epoxy sticks to the wood. If you drill all the way through, it tends to run out the back, so either way you've got to be careful. I mean, it can be done both ways, but what I found is if you take just a little bit of wax paper and put it over the hole or around the tube, push it in like that, so the tube sits upright and nothing will run out the back of the tube. And then we'll do the same thing with the second tube. We're going to mix the epoxy and do both tubes at the same time. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot of epoxy to fill the tubes because the pins are taking up most of the space. I probably fill them maybe halfway. You're going to get a lot running out over it. It's going to be a mess, but it sands off or peels off pretty easily. The way I do it is, first I get some gloves, otherwise I make a mess of myself. Find something to mix on. And I don't use a fast epoxy. This is a 30-minute cure time epoxy. Alright. I'll just mix them out. I never measure that close. Kind of eyeball things, and it seems to work pretty well. These are, I'm going to do 12 inches of tube, so I want to get a pretty fair amount of material. Can always make more. And then add the hardener. Just do two piles side by side so I can kind of eyeball them. I try and use a little bit more hardener. Don't know if it matters a whole lot, but when I'm adding a dye, now for a dye, I know they make epoxy dyes and you can go buy them at marine places where they do boats, but that gets kind of expensive. This is just an acrylic paint. Picked it up at a hobby shop. I think it cost $2, and all I'm going to put in this is just 1, 2, 3, 4 drops of paint to give me the color that I want. And then I'm going to mix it all together. And if you need it darker, if that doesn't come out dark enough, you can just add a little bit more paint, but you don't need to add a whole lot. As you can see, that all mixes up pretty good. Now to get it in the tubes. I've tried a bunch of different methods. I've tried with syringes. That makes a mess. I found the easiest way is just to drip it in the tubes. Remember that your pins are going to take up most of the place, most of the space inside the tubes. So when you're done doing this, most of what you put in is going to run out the top. This just takes a couple minutes to do. And if you get some on the outside of the tubes, don't worry about it. You're going to get more on the outside of the tubes in a few minutes. And the reason I'm alternating tubes, I just want to give it time to run to the bottom because I do want it to get to the bottom of the tube. Because everything I push out, I'm going to push out the top. You're going to have a little bit of waste on the tubes. In other words, when you sand the ends of it to make sure you get the pattern that you want. If you're working with pins that don't have a real tight fit or a real snug fit when you dry fit them, you may want to super glue them together to ensure that you get the same pattern at both ends. This is a fairly snug fit, and I've been pretty successful with this pattern without super gluing, so we'll see what happens. So let's work on one at a time here. Get the brass pin and the 4 nickel silver pins that I want, and just slide it in and push the epoxy out the top. Oh, not quite full. If I don't push any out the top when I'm done, that means I didn't put enough epoxy in there, which will mean that I'm going to have some waste at the top of this pin. I can try filling a little bit more right now to see if I can get any more in there to prevent that. With the pins in there, it might not take, but if I've got air pockets in there, then I'll just keep sanding on the grinder until I don't have an air pocket on there. So I've got 2 of the nickel silver pins in. Here goes the 3rd one. And here goes the 4th one. So I didn't get a lot spilling out the top, so I may have to sand it down to about here. So I'll have maybe a ½ inch or so of waste. Let's see what I've got on the 2nd one. I'll get a little bit more in it first. And once you get the epoxy on your gloves, everything gets slippery and messy. Missing one. Here it is. Alright, they're in. Going to let them set up.